public health, but I'll tell.
Okay, how do I get to the,
Yours on.
no, I'm pretty.
Oh, what? These are yours, Carla.
Hmm? All right, we're all refreshed. So I'll introduce myself first. I'm Carla Perna, and I am not a nurse, and I got my science degree in psychology, and I've been doing research now for about 13 years, clinical research, all oncology. Worked at the Cancer Center for 8 years, and about 3 weeks ago I took a position with the Center for Exercise Medicine and the REACT Center here on campus as their center administrator. So all of us here have a lot of experience when it comes to clinical research, but it's really interesting the different varieties of what all of us has done. So what I want to talk to you today about is pre-study activities. So one of the first questions you want to ask yourself is, what type of research are you doing? Some of the things we've talked about is, are we doing industry study? Are we doing an investigator-initiated study? So here we're talking about, is it treatment, prevention, is it diagnostic, quality of life? So there's so much research that we do here on campus. So identifying that study and then going from there and knowing what you need for that study is your starting point. Now today what I want to do is I want to identify tasks required to start a study, and I want to identify the difference between the investigator-initiated study and the industry study. So your investigator-initiated study is something that you're developing, and as we mentioned before, you have your PI, and you might have a fellow or working with a PI to develop a study here on campus, and it could be industry, so pharma. So a very critical step is doing a feasibility assessment. So I want you to pay most close attention to the it should be column. So the thorough, objective, systematic, consistent process. So this is going to be a theme as I go through my presentation today. Regardless of the study that you're doing, it's very important that you're very consistent and systematic with your processes. So you're considering the protocol and you want to know if it's feasible. The first thing you want to look at is, do you have enough staff? And are they qualified? And as we've mentioned before, most of us need some kind of equipment, whether it's a CT scan, an EKG, an MRI. We need to make sure we have the facilities and the equipment in order to do our study. And what are the training requirements? So training is very, very critical, and documenting that training and understanding that the team knows what they're doing. The budget. Do we have enough money, and how much do we need? This isn't an easy process. It is one of the most critical processes that you need to do once you've decided to move forward, because you don't want to do a study that is not feasible as far as finances go. We always work in an academic place. We have investigator-initiated studies, and those are the studies that are critically important to us as an institution that may not have enough funding, and we're having to go out and find the funding in other ways, whether it's from philanthropy or grant dollars. But when it comes to an industry study, you never want to take a loss. You never want to do that. Remember, you're working for somebody else. So you're a fee for service when it comes to industry, and you need to make sure you know what it's going to cost you to do the study. So subjects, participants. You'll hear and refer to subjects by some IRBs and participants by others. The critical thing I wanted to point out here, as we talked about the therapeutic misconception, is when a subject is part of a study, they're not called a patient. Now they are our patients, and we find them because they are our patients, but we deal with them from a patient perspective, and then we deal with them from a research perspective. The compassion and the treatment still goes on between the two, but when you're talking about research, someone in research, it is a subject or participant. Do you have that population? Very, very important that you have a database that you can go to, talk to your investigators, and know, do we have enough patients, this population? Where do we get them from? Facilities. Where are you going to do the work? And who's going to perform all the procedures? And do you have the equipment in the space? Again, this goes back to Cindy's discussion about the 1572. There's an important section on there on the front page. I think it might be number 5, I'm not real sure, maybe 4, but you have to put everywhere you're going to do the study. Here at the Cancer Center, we have an Acton Road location. So that is critically important, that we're not just putting the places that are here downtown, but if a patient's going to go out or a subject's going to go out there, we need to make sure that we have Acton Road. So you have to do that assessment too. So here's the red flags that you want to ignore when you're doing a feasibility assessment. So is it scientifically questionable? You don't want that. You want to make sure that you've got a good question and a good answer. The objectives are realistic. There can often be conflicts with your routine care or your standard of care treatment. A lot of times you might receive a budget from an industry sponsor and they've got everything marked as routine care. Well, the applicable laws within the state of Alabama are not the same with California. And so you have to know those things to know, and you also have to talk with your investigator to say, in your practice, if this patient was not a research patient, would you do this as a routine care? So that's the question you need to ask them. Regardless of the study, would you do this for this disease population? And if you can clearly say, no matter what, you can say that's routine of care. And then we've got a process in central administration where they actually look at that budget and they look at the applicable guidelines and things. And depending on the disease that you're doing, they have other guidelines that they can look at. And they say, no, this doesn't meet the guidelines. So they do all the compliance for you. We do it in the department and then we send it over there. I just mentioned inadequate budgets, the narrow inclusion-exclusion criteria. So if that is very narrow, it may be very difficult to get your patients. So it's very important that you're looking at that. And then it's not appealing to your participants or subjects. So particularly in cancer, a placebo trial will be very difficult. A patient that is very sick is not going to want to take the chance of not getting the standard of care treatment that they know might help them versus no treatment at all. So those are, within the cancer world, that's something that's very, very rare. And usually the only time you'll see that is in the later on in the phase 3 studies. Excuse me. So again, know your population, lack of patient pool. Remember, when you sign a contract with an industry study for a pharma, you are signing that contract to say, I have said I can enroll this many patients. So you're not abiding by your contract when you make that statement to them. So it's very important. So we're going to look at the clinical protocol activation process. This document has not been updated for a while. It is in our research toolbox on our Office of Sponsored Programs website, but it is still very valid in so many ways. So if you're new to research, I'm not sure if this is part of the handout that I provided you, but it's there, and it really is a good documented outline of each steps to take, and there are live links in there of who you call, who you talk to. So it isn't updated, but a lot of it is still accurate. And when I have somebody come in new to research, this is one of my go-to things that I give to them. All right, we're going to begin our study. And the first thing that usually takes place is your confidentiality agreement. Now your CDA is a confidentiality agreement usually between the sponsor and with you. It could be with an academic center like Vanderbilt and UAB. And basically this is put in place for the protection of us at UAB and with the sponsor, that we will not share their information, right? So we're going to give you the information, and usually, most usually, this CDA is required before a sponsor will ever send you the investigational brochure and the protocol. And then you get the protocol. And right here is where you look at the protocol. You might look at it, have the investigator look at it, and that the investigator, along with maybe somebody looking at a potential budget, or more likely at this stage you're looking at the feasibility of what's required in the protocol and if it's really feasible that you can do this. You know, how much time is it going to take us to do this? Is it very, time consuming? All those things. Then after you've decided you want to move forward, you're going to ask for your draft budget, your draft consent form, and your other essential regulatory documents. At this point, what you can do is really drill down into what's required for the budget. You also can take the look at the consent form versus the budget to make sure everything is, because whatever you're doing in the budget needs to be represented in that consent form for the patient. So it's very important that these documents, the contract and the consent form, has to marry on what you're saying that patient's going to have to pay for, how long the patient's going to be in the trial, and all those things. So you need to look at those things at this point. And still, you may make another decision. You may say, this is not a good trial for us because they may be offering you, I don't know, a $2,000 startup fee, non-refundable startup fee, and you're like, there's no way. And if you've got let's say a $10,000 non-refundable startup fee, that's a big gap. There's probably no way that you're going to get the sponsor up to that from $2,000. So that might be something as a manager that you would want to go and talk to them ahead of time before you put your team into doing a lot of work on the study. And then you submit to the central office here at UAB, and it's our office is the Office of Sponsor Programs. Now, as Cindy has mentioned, and maybe Penny before me, we're Western IRB for industry, and we use UAB IRB for investigator-initiated studies. Within the Cancer Center, it's not just investigator-initiated studies, it's also those consortium studies, so studies that we do with like Vanderbilt or UNC or anything like that. Anything that doesn't have money coming from, primary money coming from a sponsor, that still has to go to UAB. So you're going to prepare your team, you're going to have an internal startup meeting, and that's happening while you might have your reg team submitting and obtaining your IRB documents and approvals. So the bottom line, all of this is happening at the same time. You're getting the budget going, you're getting the contract done. At our institution, you can't have a signed contract without an approval from IRB. So that's required before the contract can get started. And so the clinical team is meeting, doing their internal. So you really want to try to have all this happen at the same time so everybody's on the same page. Once that contract is signed between you and the sponsor, that's when you can start enrolling in the trial. Go ahead.
So what if you had a clinical trial that was supported by R1, but it's investigator initiated? Would the NIH be considered the sponsor?
No, we would. The PI would. Sorry, I had to think that through a minute.
So it's only private industry dollars makes it.
That's correct, because your dollars for NIH are already here, and the dollars are here under the PI's name. So that makes it a investigator initiated and UAB as the sponsor. So then you're going to start and you have your site initiation visit, which if it's a pharma study, it's a site initiation visit, and you might call it a startup meeting if it's an investigator initiated study or consortium studies. Yeah. So as Cindy mentioned, we still do a lot of paper. And sometimes you feel like it's just shooting out of that box right there. Like, oh my gosh, I got so much paper going on. So the essential regulatory documents, it's really, really hard to tell you everything that's essential. There is, in the ICH, which I think Cindy mentioned, is so much easier to read. I think it's ICH R1 Part 6 is the most critical document, a section of the ICH that really explains everything that's required and why it's required. And there's a nice little layout of all the essential documents and who keeps what, and it's a really good guideline to look at. Now, with that, it's a guideline. And we can all say we have other documents we consider essential at our site. The important thing is that you have your standard operating procedures saying that this is what you do. So that's the critical part. They give you a guidance on what needs to be done. And if you're doing a pharma study, pharma pretty much follows that to the T. They're going to follow that and make sure that they're in line with what the ICH guidelines are saying. So why do we do that? So there's good clinical practice standards, there's applicable regulatory requirements, and these documents support the credibility of the team. As I was saying, you don't have to have degrees and you don't have to have certifications, but you have to have some kind of training document. So it could just be that you're getting trained on a particular protocol for that study. So that's the credibility, is saying Carla did the required specific protocol training, and so that makes this credible. So it could be, now many of us are degreed and certified, but it's important that everybody realizes that regardless of what that person, if they're doing something essential in the trial, it's important that they document their credibility, and that's done through training. And with a sponsor study, it's usually protocol specific. And the GCP, I think we do City here and the other things. Some sponsors will take that training that we do on site here at IRB, but the others may have their own specific GCP training. So all of that is something to think about too when you're looking at what is required for this study, and that's a time element to do that training. So what else they do is it lets the FDA and your regulatory sponsor and the regulatory authorities and the FDA to evaluate the conduct of the trial, the quality of data produced. So the delegation of authority log, or some people call it the signature log, is very critical to the FDA. As Cindy mentioned, we have the 1572, which is a contract between the sponsor and the investigator. But the delegation of authority log, or that signature log, is one of the first documents the FDA is going to ask for. They want to know who the PI has delegated authority to. So they're not going to want to see a data manager signing off on a CRF that has not been delegated to do that job by the PI. PI is responsible. So a little bit more on essential regulatory documents and why we want to make sure the sponsor has theirs, as I mentioned to you in the ICH 6, tells you what stays on their site and what stays on ours. Another thing that's important to mention is within your group, you may not have all your essential documents in one place. In the Cancer Center, we have essential documents in the trial master file, but we also have the clinical team that keeps essential documents over in our research chart, shadow chart, whatever it's called. And so those ECRFs are essential documents. They don't stay in the regulatory binder in the regulatory file. The signed contract between the sponsor, that does not go into our regulatory file. We keep that somewhere else. All these documents go together when we get ready to put things up for the trial, when we're filing everything away. But it depends on your group and how you work. If you have a one-stop shop study coordinator, you're probably going to have it all together in one binder. So there's no certain way to do it. Just have an SOP of how you're going to keep your essential documents. Okay, so reminding you that a study involving an IND or an IDE, okay? The person or company who holds the IND or the IDE is the sponsor. Okay, that's critical. That can be a company, it could be your PI, it could be the government, it could be UAB. So as we mentioned a minute ago, when we're doing R01s and our PI we submit to the FDA and we get an IND, we hold that IND, and that makes UAB and the PI the sponsor of that trial. So different ways. Remember, as a sponsor, Dr. UAB has the same responsibilities as any industry sponsor. So you might have your SOPs a little bit different, but again, systematic, consistent processes for how you manage your regulatory documents and the things that you do really should not vary too much between your industry studies and your investigator-initiated studies, although some of the documents might. Do y'all feel this way? No? Y'all are so quiet. A little bit of a laugh. So it didn't take me long to feel this way when I got into research. There is so much to learn. The important thing is to know is that, especially if you surround yourself like we're doing today with people that know, use your resources and follow the guidelines and take your time and make sure that you understand what you're doing, because you don't want this to happen and something really, really... Now, I used to tell my team all the time when I was in the cancer center that they are welcome to come in my office and do that to me, as long as it's not directed at me, because they're going to feel that way and they need a place to let it out, because it gets a little bit crazy sometimes. But it's very important that we all have a way to vent our frustrations, and it can get very frustrating sometimes working in research, as it does with many other things. So don't panic. All right? As I said, organization and consistency. So GCP does not provide a guide to organizing your essential documents. And that's what I mentioned earlier. Your SOPs within your department should guide you on how you organize these documents, whether it's in one place, whether it's in several different places. It's important that the team understand where they are and why you have them where they are, right? So create your best way to do this. The Cancer Center is a huge team, and there's 40-some people on the clinical and the admin side working on these studies. And so it's very, very difficult if you've got that size of a team to have everything in one place. So in the Cancer Center, that's not the way that it works. But that doesn't mean it wouldn't work that way for you. So that's very important that you remember that. Once you've organized it, once you've gotten it down and you figure out how you want to do it, be consistent, all right? Use your resources. Don't assume something is supposed to be the way that it is. Go to your GCPs, your ICHs, go to your tools here on campus, and especially other researchers to get your information. Ask all your questions. So briefly, I just want to tell you the difference between the consent and assent. So in the state of Alabama, this has got to be changed, but a minor in Alabama now is 18 and younger. So I have to update this slide. And so they have to sign an assent, and which means they have to have a legally acceptable representative sign also. And the consent is for the adult, and there's different signatures requirements for both. So make sure you look that up and you know the difference. So here I have a list of essential regulatory documents. As I said, this does not include all of your documents, but this is just an example of, if you need some kind of a special approval. It could be an FDA approval if it's an investigator-initiated study. Those CVs and those licenses, where are you keeping those? Where are you knowing that the people that are running your trial got the training to do what they're doing? FDA 1572, same thing. Financial disclosures are very important. your CLIA and your CAP or your labs, saying that your labs have been certified and they can do the study. And we also have to have lab normals. Those have to be presented to the sponsor. We have a link now where the sponsor can just get the lab normals, and my former reg team would just send the link to the sponsor to go out there and get those. So critical logs to maintain, again, your delegation of authority. You'll hear the terminology DOA. You'll also hear people say signature log. It seems like I'm hearing more sponsors go away from the DOA and they're saying site signature log. I think it just depends on who's doing the study. And that basically says, I've delegated Carla to do X. I've delegated Cindy to do X. And that keeps it straight. And if I'm asked to do something and I know that I'm not on that delegation of authority log as saying that I can consent a patient, then I don't need to do that or need to get it updated, right? Monitoring, training, your serious adverse events, and protocol deviations. So, again, the monitoring, the SAEs and the protocol deviations may all be in another area. They may not all be together. Just know they're important, essential documents, and you need to have them. So the budget. All right, can you afford the study? I've mentioned that before. How are you going to get reimbursed? All right, and are you going to get reimbursed adequately? Most sponsors want to pay on a quarterly basis. You know, I would argue, or not argue, but I would really, really ask very, very nicely to please let me get money every month. But most of them will not do that. And when you're working with an industry sponsor, they set up, most of the time they set up their payments to all sites. They may have 12 sites, and they've got a system that applies to all, because they can't say I'll do this for UAB and do this for someone else. So that's a little bit of a challenge to do. And a lot of times you may be asked to be involved in a study, and it may be industry, but it may be like breakthrough, cutting edge, as RPIs like to say, sexy medicine, and you may not really have enough funds, but there might be somewhere else that the PI can use to supplement it. So if it's a very important trial, that's something to consider. Don't forget, it's so critical that you just take the time to line item all activities to get a study going, okay? Your startup, your meetings, all of that is money. And it's so critical that you make this non-refundable dollars. Now, because by the time you sign that contract, you've done all this work. And for a sponsor to ask for it back isn't appropriate. They're going to try. I've actually seen, in more recent, I've seen some sponsors actually say, can we pay you half of it and pay you the other half when you get your first patient on? Because they want to know they have data. So they're going to try that. And you're actually signing a contract to say, you know, we will provide this. The other thing I saw was, we'll pay you the full non-refundable startup fee, but if you don't have a patient on within 3 months, we're asking for X back. They'll try all kinds of things, and that's something that you have to figure out within your department. Is it feasible to do those kind of things? It's very hard, and that's why the population is so important when you're looking at the population of your trial. Remember, the sponsor is requiring or expecting you, and it really is. You're not meeting your requirements if you say I'm going to enroll 5 patients and you can't do that. And so it's up to you. They're trusting you to provide them some data. And when you can't do that, or you realize you can't do that, the quicker you can let the sponsor know something's happened, I can't find the patients, the better they're going to like you. When you can say, I don't need to be wasting my time here. So you got your per subject activity. So you have all of your, I'm trying to think of the right terminology, not the patient activity, but the study activities. So you have all these study activities like your teleconferences and your monitoring and all these things that are required to run the study properly. So those are things that you look at, but then you also look at the per patient budget. So that's critical too. And don't forget about your ongoing activities like a protocol amendment coming in. When a protocol amendment comes in, there's a review that has to be done. There's submissions to the IRB. There is the budget the budget team looking over to make sure there are no budget changes at all. So there's activities. The PI is reviewing it. The coordinator's reviewing it. So look through that and figure out. And so what I did is just said, so for a protocol activity, protocol amendment, the nurse does this and how much time, the PI does this and how much time, the reg does this, and I came up with a cost for a protocol amendment. Never had it turned down by a sponsor. So it's activity and it's required. So think about all those things. Talk with your team as a team, because there's going to be things that they call hidden cost that'll be there. Your closeout activities, same thing. Take each activity and break it down into who's involved and come up with a cost for that. Justifying all your expenses. So that's why you do the internal budget. Your internal budget is not something that goes out to the sponsor. Your internal budget is a very detailed budget that says, I'm charging $500 for a protocol amendment because these people all do this for this amount of time. So if anybody ever comes in and does an audit, you are consistently saying, this costs me to do this across the continuum of all of your studies. And if you get a sponsor that says, I'm not going to pay for that protocol amendment, but I'll give you more dollars over here, your internal budget should state, I'm not getting the $500 for the protocol amendment because I'm getting it over here from this. So it's very, very important that internal budget is justified. And your compliance. So here we have the clinical billing review. We're so grateful for these people. They take our budgets, they look them over, they make sure that we're compliant with all of the guidelines. We do our initial, but they come out with more information, and they always really are good if they are in disagreement with the PI to get justification from the PI if the PI is saying something is routine that they don't see should be routine. So research, investigational service, standard of care is an established service. Again, always ask yourself the question, if this patient was not on a research study, would I provide this service to them as a routine service for this disease group? So that's very important. So federal, we have a national coverage decision, the clinical research policy, and it's billing for clinical services in a clinical trial, and notification of the subjects regarding the cost. This is what I mentioned earlier about your contract and your consent form, marrying and matching up what you're saying you're going to do, cost in the contract. You need to be informing your subjects what you see their cost is going to be for the study. And we have our local Medicare review policies and other guidelines. In the Cancer Center, one of the big guidelines is the National Comprehensive Cancer Network. So the NCCN guidelines are very critical to that. All right, so the Center for Medicaid Services, CMS, so they evaluate everything, and they do an assessment across the institution. The cost of noncompliance, in other words, billing Medicare or Medicaid for something that you shouldn't be billing them for. A good example would be billing for seeing a patient and the patient actually didn't come in that day, right? May not be knowing and may not be willingly, but that's why it's so important that we have a system in place. We don't want to say that X was here and was treated or had a visit and billed a service and it didn't happen. And that of course, that's a big obvious one, but there's a lot of little ones too. So there's a lot of, they may tell you you can't be part of the Medicare or Medicaid program here anymore if you get deemed real big and they find out you're doing a lot of stuff that isn't right. Public relations, huge. You know, all of a sudden there's a big black mark, you know, that you're not doing what you need to do. And then of course there's always criminal and civil penalties and whistleblowers. So this is maybe a handout that I gave you, I'm not sure. But it's a schedule of events. So this is kind of what I was explaining, that you can take this and you see this is in the protocol. It's a section, sometimes it'll be embedded in the protocol. Most likely it's an appendix to the protocol. And so you want to look at your schedule of events. This is something that you get with the protocol. So you can kind of take a gander at that right at the beginning. And then this is an example of a budget template. And so you'll notice that all of this stuff is eligibility criteria, medical history, if there's a cancer history, any of those kind of things. And you're just kind of going through and you're adding, what do you see might be potential costs? These are not real costs. I went in and messed it all up, so I wasn't like out there putting, but I wanted you to see how this is done. So you have cycle 1, all your cycles across the board. So it's very detailed and it says how much money, and then your internal budget will explain what's involved in each one of these. Contract process. Again, you have your CDA, UAB guidelines. This is all in your research toolbox on OSP. You have your department and division review and approval of your budget and your contract language. Again, your protocol amendments, your study changes, you got renegotiation. So if you have it in your contract that you're going to get paid for an amendment review, then it should be in there. You should get the money. Then your OSP has to review and know your OSP officer. Very critical. If you know your person over there that you can call and ask questions to, it's very, very helpful. Execute a contract is required prior to study startup. Again, that requires IRB approval to get that contract signed. And you also need to make sure that your PI, your administrator, your coordinators, everybody understands your commitments, your financial commitments. What are you saying that you're going to do in this study? So a little bit on ClinicalTrials.gov. There will be sessions just on ClinicalTrials.gov. You'll notice if you look through some of the training that we provide, this is a very important training session. And we have to register all of our studies in CT.gov. And this rule came down by the FDAAA in September 27th, September of 2007. And it said the current clinical trial registration requirements with new results reporting. So all of it has to be in there. Every trial has to be listed. So it added the enforcement provisions penalties, and it impacted the applicable Clinical Trials Act. So what is an applicable clinical trial? So trials of drugs and biologics, and we have trials of devices, and these are behaviorals coming. So any trial that you're doing with a drug or any kind of biologic or any device must be enrolled or listed in ClinicalTrials.gov. Training. So this is all in your regulatory binder, your city, your UAB website, your GCP, the travelers at TKC and hospital. We work a lot with the VA. That's every 2 years. All of this stuff you need to have a training section in your binder, or some people just have an individual training binder that they actually put all the training in, so it's very easy to locate it that way also. So just to list a little bit of our available training, the OSP website, the Researcher's Toolkit, the Research Training Program, which is 2 times annually. This actually started out as Research Coordinator Training Program, I believe, RCTP, and it's changed to RTP. I highly recommend it. I've never been a coordinator, but it's a great program for anybody who does research here. It expounds on what we're teaching you today, but gives you a lot more in-depth information on each of the subjects we're all talking to you about. The research seminar series, I think we're going to change how often we're having this, but we've been doing it first 3 Thursdays of the month. That's here at PCAMS, and that's where Penny might do a session on ClinicalTrials.gov. So watch out for that and see when those are going to be done. If there's something that particularly relates to your job and what you're doing, And always feel free to let any of us know if there's some training that's not being available, that's not available that you need, because we need that feedback. The Lunch and Learn Quarterly, there's some changes undergoing with the CTO. This is something that hasn't started back up, but should hopefully soon. Very, very important that at least one person within your department is delegated to attend this meeting and come back and take the information back to the team, because you might have research pharmacy giving a presentation. You might have the React Center, which I'm working with now, giving a presentation. So there's all kinds of information that you can receive at this that might be important to someone on your team. Sponsor required training. As I said, even though we have Do the City training here at UAB, a lot of sponsors require their own GCP training. Take that into account in your budget. Because it's not like your team's not trained. They're trained. They've all got their GCP training that's required by our institution. So if they require additional training, that's time. So there's all kinds of things you need to look at in regarding to training. And you must maintain a log of this training. I think Cindy mentioned just saying that it's been done. And this is one of the most difficult things as a regulatory administrator, is to get people to understand that you can't just say, yeah, I went over the amendment with someone. It's very important to have it documented. So you're organizing and planning, you're creating your implementation plan, you're creating a recruitment plan, and this third circle is so important to so many trials, and it's something that may be difficult to get your department to do, but especially when it comes to investigator-initiated trials. I think it's very important, because if you do a mock run-through of something, you notice your gaps, you notice what you're missing, and I think it's very, very important to do this, and it's very hard to get a large group to do this. And establish what goals you're trying. Everybody is on the same plan. Recruitment, this is the process of getting your participants in the door, all right? And it's notifying them of the study, time of notification of the study to the enrollment. So the studies, you're telling people, my study's here, my study's ready to go, and getting your patient on. So that's all your recruitment. And your retention is keeping them in the study. So very important that if you don't recruit and retain your study subjects, could lead into invalid and inclusive results. So very critical to an investigator-initiated study here at our site. And it can prolong the trial and could have premature termination of your trial. And you could have increased costs. And it's considered unethical to not fully recruit. So again, if you're telling somebody, or you've submitted a protocol to the FDA saying I need 12 evaluable subjects to come up with the data, meet my objectives. We are not going to meet them if you don't have 12 evaluable subjects. So that's important. So there's the mock subject again. It's practicing your consenting. I think this would be extremely important for within the cancer center, we were having sometimes 30-page consents. And I mean, sometimes it's very, very difficult for someone to have the time to go over every single thing, but they have to. It's critical to the consent process, especially if you've got somebody new that's consenting. I think it's very important. Identifying your supplies, noting your supplies are there. You get a signed contract. Oops, I don't have my supplies. Delays the trial. So somebody needs to be looking and getting those things in. And critical is reimbursements and managing those reimbursements and having somebody that is following through on getting your money in the door. And how is the invoicing going to take place? When is it going to take place? Who is your primary person, and who might be backing them up for what or for when? If it's hotels, travel, reimbursements of your subjects, if it's getting paying radiology, paying your research pharmacy. Who's all doing that? Who's doing it? So what are your expectations? When you establish regular meetings with a team, you kind of can all stay on the same page to understand what you need to be. You review your enrollment goals and your enrollment plan. You're looking at the status of your regulatory documents. So with an industry study, the monitor is going to send a letter, say, hey, I'm just reminding you I'm coming on this day. That's your word, that's your notice. Hey, I need to make sure my ECRFs are done. I need to look at my binder and make sure everything's updated in there so that you're prepared for your monitor. And reviewing the overall strengths and weaknesses of the study. And some people might want to meet weekly, some monthly, some quarterly. It all depends on what type of study you're doing and how involved and how difficult that study might be. So, you can activate once you've got all your documents in place, your contract's executed with that IRB approval, and all your training is completed. Any questions? All right, few for you. What is not part of the feasibility? Just shout it out. There's no penalties. Who? Go ahead. Who's?
JCP.
That's right. That's right. So you always need to check if you got enough participants. You always need to look at how much your study is going to cost. You need to know if you got the place to do it. And you need to know if you have the personnel. We need to know our GCPs, but you don't review that and put that. You don't review that and have that as part of your feasibility. All right, which is not an essential regulatory document.
Feasibility assessment.
That's correct. It is not an essential regulatory document. The sponsor can be all of the above. Some of the tasks required to start a study include start a study.
Perna, A, C, and D.
That's correct. That is correct. We cannot review collection of study data because we don't have any. And one last one.
False.
False. Right. They do not provide a document how to organize. You need to decide within your team how your documents are organized. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
So we had a change in our schedule. Karen Savage is sick, so Lee Powell from cardiovascular disease is going to do the presentation, and Lee and Karen and a couple others were in the group that developed the slides in the education. So Lee is going to talk to you today, and I told her she could just introduce herself and talk a little bit about her experience. Hey everybody, so like Cindy said, I'm Lee Powell. I'm a research coordinator with cardiology. So I've been doing research since 2007, and I've been with cardiology almost 3 years now. So today we're going to talk about what goes on during the study. So once we've got everything ready to go, now we're going to talk about what we do once the study's active. Okay, sorry, messed it up. Okay, so what do you need to know? Okay, so everything about the protocol. That sounds really large, I know, saying the protocol, because the protocol is very big, but it is your responsibility to know that protocol. You can't memorize it, but it's there for you to go back to. It's your reference. The manual, your MOP, your manual of procedures, you have that as a source. If your site has SOPs, so your standard operating procedures, and the investigator brochure for drug studies, you have that as well. And of course, GCPs, good clinical practice, is very important to know. So what's critical for success? You want to always continue with PI oversight. The PI is the one who's going to be over everything. He's in charge of everything, overlooking everything. Of course, you've got to follow that protocol. You've got that there for you. If you have questions, you always want to refer back to that and talk to the sponsor. If there's something in the protocol that doesn't make sense to you or you're unclear about, you always want to confirm it with the sponsor. So once you're following that protocol, you're going to enroll and follow your subjects. You're going to maintain your fiscal responsibilities. You also have got to make sure that your regulatory documents are current, making sure that nothing is going to expire, such as a consent form or any of your other important regulatory documents. You want to keep those in line. You also want to make sure that you have an internal quality management plan. So this is to make sure that within your department that you're following the correct steps, that you're not missing anything, that those consent forms and that all those deadlines with the IRB are being followed. So you want to make sure you have that. And you want to communicate regularly as a team to just review the process, see how things are going, see if you're having any challenges, what may be working, what's not. So you want to just really make sure that you communicate with your entire research team. So the recruitment plan. So you've got your recruitment plan, now you want to implement that plan. So you're looking to see who is your study population. Like who are we going to enroll from? Where are we going to actually find these patients? And what is your goal? How many patients are you wanting to enroll? And you want to, if you're looking at disease-specific population, do you have a database? Are you going to a database to search for these patients? Are you going to put flyers in clinics? So to help look for patients that are there, to remind your doctors, for patients who are actually in clinic, for them to see that flyer and for them to see if they're interested or they might be a good candidate. You may want to send letters to outside providers to try to get them to help recruit. You also want to make sure you can even do real-time recruitment during clinics. When you're there in clinic, you can look at impact to see what patients are here this day. Is there anyone that could qualify? Also, there are community and support groups that may be a good benefit to go to them to look for patients. And Power Trials is pending, but that's another advocate that we can use when that's available. So once you're looking at that plan, you want to, or also healthy controls. You can, we have researchmatch.org. I don't know if any of y'all are familiar with that or have seen that. But that is, it's great for patients. It's for patients who are looking for trials and for academic sites who are looking for patients. So patients can go there and just search by disease population or whatever, just a certain type of study they may be interested in, and that's a good way to get some patients. The UAB reporter, of course, we mentioned flyers. You see flyers all throughout campus, I know, for studies. Radio and other media ads can be an option as well, just by word of mouth. Also, previous volunteers, if they were already a healthy control, a lot of times they're interested in doing it again. And it's also important if you can to provide compensation, maybe free medical tests, anything that you can provide to them for being a volunteer is helpful. So when we're looking at your recruitment plan, you want to try to make sure you evaluate when it may not be working. So, you've got that enrollment goal, you know how many patients you want to enroll, and if things are kind of going slowly or you're seeing some hiccups in your plan, you want to meet and talk about that. You don't want to just kind of let it go for a while. So weekly meetings to discuss what's working, what are your hurdles are really important. The coordinator and the PI, you really want to coordinate. You want to talk to each other, you want to communicate. So it's important for the PI to know, well, I thought I had this many patients. What is it that you're seeing? Why are they not, being a good candidate? Are there some inclusion-exclusion criteria that's really making it hard? Discuss the strengths and weaknesses of your recruitment plan. And if you decide you want to change your plan, if you say, hey, I think there's this other clinic, there's another group, a patient population that we can recruit from, you want to make sure if you're going to change your plan that the IRB is notified, because you've already let them know where you're recruiting from. So you want to make sure you update them of any changes. And what do you do when that enrollment goal is met? So say you have enrolled all your patients you want. You want to see if the PI, does he want to enroll any further patients? Does he want to change that? Do you need to amend the contract if you're going to change your enrollment goal? And of course, see if you need to amend the IRB HSP. Okay, so informed consent. Okay, informed consent is a very, very important part of enrolling your patients. Consenting the subject with the correct IRB approved stamped version is critical. As you can see up here at the top, when you get a UAB IRB consent, they're gonna have the top left, it's going to actually be handwritten, the date of approval and then the expiration date. So it's sometimes easy to say you're in a hurry, you're just going to grab the consent form. Double check, make sure it's not expired. And then if you have the Western IRB, if it's the Central IRB, you'll see that you have your stamped approval date. And that does not have an expiration date with the WIRB. So it's not gonna expire yearly. As UAB, you'll have an annual review and an annual expiration date. But with Western IRB, you're going to have just an approval date. Now, if you have an amendment or a change in a new consent, you will have that new Western IRB approved consent date. So it's really important for you to know as the coordinator or the PI who's consenting the patient that that is the most current stance date. Even though there's not an expiration date on the WIRB, the Western IRB one, you want to make sure that's still the correct date. And then when you actually are consenting, you've got to document what that process is. What did you do while you're consenting the patient? And it's really important, only those individuals that are delegated by the PI are the ones that should consent the patient. And that if you're delegated, you will have this listed on the delegation log of who can and cannot, or who can consent, excuse me. And also when you submit to the IRB, you're going to be telling them who is going to be consenting. Is it the PI, the sub-investigators, the coordinators? The patient definitely needs to have a thorough reading and understanding of that consent form before signing it. All questions need to be answered. There needs to be a conversation with the investigator and the subject, as well as the coordinator, to follow up and answer questions. The subject needs to have, or they have to have, a minimum of 24 hours before signing that consent form. So they need to have gone home with that. You can mail it to them, but unless there's a waiver. Some studies do have a waiver of that 24-hour period, but if your study doesn't have a waiver for that, you've got to make sure they have that time and that you document that I gave them the consent form on this day, they had at least this amount of time. You just want to make sure that you don't just see someone in clinic and consent them that day, even if they want to. A lot of times the patients will say, I'm ready to sign up today. I'm going to read it. I don't have any more questions. I'm ready. You still have to abide by that 24-hour time period. You're going to make sure once they sign the consent form, you give the subjects a copy of the signed form. Not just a copy of the consent, but a copy of the form that they signed. And you want to document that you did that. I think I mentioned, but questions, of course, should be answered before they sign the consent form. And you want to document that. What questions were asked? What did y'all discuss? They need, of course, to have a clear understanding of the protocol and their involvement when you're done. It's important to ask open-ended questions when you're going over this with them. You don't want to just say, hey, Mr. Smith, do you understand what you just read? And, he's going to say, sure, yes. But it's important to quiz the patients. Can you tell me, what's involved? Can you tell me how many times you're going to have to come back to clinic? Ask questions like that so they can really understand their commitment and what they're signing up for. Because, we want to enroll the patients, but we want to keep the patients as well. So just asking open-ended questions is important. So this is an example, I know it's kind of small probably in your slides, but of how you're going to document that consent process. This is, each site or each group might have a little bit of a different form, but this is just really important. With every consent form, you're going to document this. It's going to have the investigator's name, the approval date of that consent, the expiration date, and going over questions about, did you answer all questions? Did you give a copy of the signed form? So this is just a nice checklist for you to make sure when you're documenting that you're answering all those appropriate questions. And also you want to remember that if you have an amendment and you have a new consent form, every time you get that new consent form signed by the subject, you want to do another one of these documentation forms and just always file them together. Any questions?